Welcome and thank you for joining today's conference, Posting of Individual Salmonella Category Status for Poultry Carcass Establishments. Please note that all participant lines will be muted until the Q&A portion of the call. We'll provide you with instructions on how to ask a verbal question at that time. You are welcome to submit written questions during the presentation, and these will be addressed at the end of the presentation. To submit a written question, use the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Choose All Panelists from the Send To drop-down menu. With that, I'll turn the call over to Paul Kicker, Acting Administrator of FSIS. Please go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today on the Salmonella webinar. My name is Paul Kicker. I'm the Acting FSIS Administrator. During today's webinar, we're going to go over the details of the Salmonella categories for raw poultry sampling, chicken and turkey carcasses. On Monday, January 22nd, 2018, FSIS will resume web posting of individual establishments' category status for the Salmonella performance standard for poultry carcasses. By posting these categories, FSIS is incentivizing high performance and is motivating firms to protect consumers. This move provides consumers with better insight into in-plant practices and could lead to industry-wide improvements in food safety practices. Testing for Salmonella and Campylobacter contamination for raw poultry products are good indicators of an establishment's ability to maintain process control, since these human pathogens are found in live poultry, during live animal rearing, and during slaughter and processing operations. I want to give a quick overview of the categories and how the agency arrives at the assigned categories. In short, we use three categories to describe the level of process control in plants. Category 1 establishments show consistent process control. These are establishments that have achieved 50% or less of the Salmonella maximum allowable % positive during all completed 52-week moving windows over the last 3 months. Category 2 establishments show variable process control. Establishments that meet the Salmonella maximum allowable % positive for all completed 52-week moving windows have results greater than 50% of the maximum allowable % positive during any completed 52-week moving window over the last 3 months. And finally, Category 3 establishments show highly variable process control. This category includes establishments that have exceeded the Salmonella maximum allowable % positive during any completed 52-week moving window over the last 3 months. Every week, FSIS assesses sampling results to categorize an establishment's process control, and those calculations are available in PHIS. However, the monthly calculations will be posted to the FSIS webpage. Going forward, one of the next steps for FSIS is to begin to post the categories relative to Salmonella for individual establishments that produce chicken parts and comminuted poultry products in June of 2018. Thank you all for your time. I will now turn the presentation over to Todd Reed.
Hello, thank you. I am Todd Reed. I'm a Senior Advisor here at FSIS, and I'll be going through the presentation today and be happy to answer any questions we have once we get to the end. So hopefully everyone can see the presentation if you've logged into the WebEx. If not, recheck the link and be there, but it should be available. Today I'm talking about the individual Salmonella category status for poultry carcass establishments. Brief overview, we're going to look at the nuts and bolts of Salmonella categories for chicken and turkey carcasses, and by the end you're going to know how samples are assigned, how categories are determined, how establishments move between categories, and when, where, and how the data is available. So let's start with our sampling practices, and we'll look specifically both at large and smaller, very small establishments. In this first section, we're going to talk about the sampling practices for young chicken and turkey carcasses. We're going to review the scheduling of routine samples, the frequency of sampling assignments, and review follow-up sampling assignments. So starting with routine samples. As you're probably aware, in this sampling project, FSIS looks at active establishments with annual slaughter totals of greater than 20,000 birds, and we include these establishments in the monthly sampling frame. This excludes religious exempt, and we have special sampling projects that look at religious exempt and very low volume producers right now under an exploratory program. When we're assigning samples, each establishment is assigned to a daily production volume category based on their annual average daily slaughter volume. So we take all your data over a year and we put each establishment into that category. And then within each category, samples are assigned based on several factors that are in the FRN, but the main ones are past salmonella rates and production volumes. So this is kind of an example looking at like a real month of data, and I've kind of got the same information on another slide that's going to follow, so you can see it two different ways. But basically, the way to read this slide is, if you look at production volumes over the last month, right, so we started with establishments that slaughter 20,000 birds a year, and then based on the number of birds they slaughtered in the previous month, we converted that to a weight. And so we kind of bend each establishment by a weight, and that's the horizontal axis along the bottom is the weight of their average daily production on the previous month. And then on the left, on the vertical column, that's the average number of samples assigned to establishments in that grouping by chicken and turkey. And what you can see here is it's not an exact number because the samples are assigned using a statistical algorithm, so there's a little bit of variance within each range. So month to month, for example, it might be 2 to 3 if you're slaughtering 6,001 to 50,000 pounds per day, but more or less you're in that same ballpark. And so kind of to reiterate what I just said, larger volume establishments are assigned more samples than smaller volume establishments, with a maximum of 5 samples assigned per month per product. They said some randomization is involved, resulting in slight variations from month to month, and all establishments get assigned at least 10 samples per year. So looking at that same information a different way, because certain people like to see tables versus bars, you can see if you take the average daily production volume in pounds of that previous month, on the far left column, you can see kind of the range of the typical numbers of the samples that get assigned to those establishments for chicken and turkey carcasses in the next two. All right, moving forward, follow-up sampling. When establishments do not meet the Salmonella performance standard, for example, they hit Category 3, they're going to receive follow-up sampling. Currently, 16 follow-up samples are assigned in most situations. For low-volume producers, FSIS assigns 8 follow-up samples, as we explained in the FRN, if you need details. But in most cases, everyone gets 16. All right, next step, and really kind of the meat of today's discussion and what we wanted to get to, how does FSIS make category determinations? In this section, we want to discuss how FSIS makes category determinations, and basically we're going to start with category definitions. How do we define the categories? Then we're going to review kind of how it's a two-step process of how we make that category determination. I found that that's the easiest way, at least for me, to think about it and keep it straight. And we're going to review specifically the percent positive calculation that's used in that process, and we're going to briefly touch on an adjusted rule that we use for establishments with a fewer number of samples to make sure we don't unfairly classify anyone, and it's a way that we found that adjusts using statistics. Establishment category definitions, and these match what Paul Kicker said at the beginning. So Category 1 establishments, consistent process control, establishments that achieve 50% or less of the maximum allowable percent positive during all completed 52-week windows of the last 13 weeks or 3 months. And so what we've done is operationally 3 months ends up being 13 weeks, and to make it consistent in our code we call it 13 weeks. But either way, it's the same thing. Category 2, variable process control, establishments at or below the maximum allowable percent positive for all completed 52-week moving windows, but have results greater than 50% of the maximum allowable percent positive during any completed 52-week window over the last 13 weeks. And that was a mouthful. But basically what we're saying is, out of the last 13 windows, there was at least one window where the establishment had more than 50% of the performance standard, but they never exceeded the performance standard, so they never got to Category 3. Category 3, then, is highly variable process control, and that includes establishments with greater than the maximum allowable percent positive during any completed moving window over the last 13 weeks. So if one of those moving windows, which we'll explain to in a second, an establishment had above the performance standard, they're in Category 3 while it's counted. This table just summarizes the same information that we said in those, and it actually kind of puts in the percent positives as outlined in the Federal Register notice. So you can see in Category 3, right, that's the performance standard cutoff. So if you're greater than that percent positive, then you're going to be in Category 3. Category 1 is 1/2 of Category 3. So if you're less than 1/2 every single month, every single window of those 13 windows, then you're in Category 1, and Category 2 is in the middle. Determining categories. It's kind of a two-step process. So the first thing we do is if you think about like a calendar in your mind, how you've got like a calendar with months and you've got all the weeks going across, every Saturday, right, every single week we do step 1, where we determine a percent positive for that window. And for every week we're going to end up with a number for step 1 of what's the percent positive and what's the category for that window. And that week we're going to take the most recent 52 weeks, we're going to take every sample in those 52 weeks, and we're going to compute the percent positive for those 52 weeks. And we're going to compare those to the performance standards that we just talked to, compare those to the percentage. So every single week there's going to be a number calculated and a category calculated for that one 52-week window. So if you can think in your mind, if you've got a calendar, now you've got this giant series of categories by week. Step 2 is we look at the most recent 13 of those, and that's where we compute. We look at all 13 of the most recent, and we say, were they all in Category 1? If so, you're in Category 1. Were any of them in Category 3? If so, then you're in Category 3. And if you're not in either one of those two, and you have computed categories for at least one window, then you're going to end up in Category 2. And usually that's where an establishment has some in Category 1 and some in Category 2, but they don't have any Category 3s. So again, it's a two-step process. We compute each window for each week, and then every week we look over the last 13. And so this Saturday, I look at the last 13 windows. Next Saturday, right, I'm going to include one more weeks of data, so I'm going to add one more at the end of the calendar, but I'm going to take off the one at the very beginning. So it like moves across time across your calendar, 13, 13, 13, 13. And so every time we move, that's the establishment's new official category. And kind of foreshadowing, when we talk about posting data, if you use your industry account in PHIS, you can see your most recent category, and you can get that report and you can print that out. But if you want to wait and look at the website, then you can see what it was in the previous month, and we update on the website once a month. So you kind of have two options if you want to get it once a month or if you want to get it once a week. So this graphic kind of illustrates what we were talking about before, right? So if you see, starting from the top working down, every single week we'll potentially collect one or more samples. Then for that week we look at 52 weeks of data, and we compute a category for that 52 weeks. And then, using kind of the brown box, we would look at 13 of those windows. And so when we take 13 of those windows together, that's how we move forward. All right, percent positive calculation. This is just kind of technical details that hopefully is straightforward, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the performance standard is based on a percentage. And so what we do is for every establishment, we take the number of samples that were collected in that last 52 weeks when we do step 1. This is on step 1. And we look at those samples that were collected, and we say how many positives did you have out of how many total, and we just compute a straight percentage. Now, one of the things that we do is we have a minimum number of samples, so 11 for young chicken carcasses and 14 for young turkey carcasses. Assuming the percentage you have is still within bounds, and that's the second bullet point I'll get to in a second, if you have fewer samples than that, then we don't evaluate you against the performance standard because we don't have enough data. The exception is the third bullet. If in those 11 or 14 samples, you already had so many positives, an establishment had so many positives that we could add on extra negatives, but those extra negatives still keep you in Category 3, well, then we would go ahead and categorize that establishment. Because they have so many positives, there's no need for us to wait. We already know if we added on negatives, we would get the same result. So if an establishment had too few samples in at least one of those 13 moving windows, then they kind of get an NA for that one window, but then we look across everything, and if you get categorized, then we go ahead and make the category. So the next thing we want to talk about is adjusted percent positive. So if you remember at the beginning, we talked about establishments that don't have the full 51 samples for chicken or the full number for turkey. Well, in that case, we still want to compare those establishments to the performance standard because we want to be fair to everyone and compare all establishments, but what we don't want to do is accidentally penalize an establishment that had fewer. So what these two slides do is show how we calculate that percentage, but we actually adjust it just to make sure and make safe that we're not accidentally being unfair. So the first thing we do is we take the number of positives that you had, and if an establishment had 4 positives, and you can see down at the bottom, we would actually decrease the number of positives by 1. So we say, now let's say it's 3 instead of 4, but we count all the negatives. We count everything in the denominator so that when we compute the percentage actually decreases a little bit when we compare against the performance standard. So this honestly definitely makes up for the fact that we have fewer samples than we would like to target. All right, so performance standards for small establishments, right, because smaller establishments with fewer shifts and production days typically are scheduled for fewer samples. Fewer samples mean that an establishment could potentially be passing or failing, but due to random chance, we might misclassify the establishment. So the analogy is if you're flipping a coin 5 times, you click it 1,000 times, you're going to be close to 50%. But if you flip it 5 times, any given 5, you accidentally may get a lot of heads or a lot of tails. So that's the analogy of why we're doing this. And again, as I explained at the bottom, to counterbalance, that's where we adjust the percent positive by decreasing one of it. And so this is an actual example of the percentages we would get and how it impacts the category. So you can see on the first row in this table, the adjusted percent positive, if we collected 25 samples and there were three positives, right, both rows are the same, by adjusting it, we go from 3 minus 1, which is really 2 over 25, which gives us 8%, which is a category 2. If we didn't adjust it, if we had left it in, that establishment would have had 3 out of 25, which is 12%, which is category 3. So again, for establishments right on the cutoff, this helps us kind of give a little bit more wiggle room so we don't accidentally penalize an establishment. If you're not anywhere near the cutoff, then it's not going to impact the establishment at all. So let's do a couple of examples that I think hopefully help to clarify this as well. In this section, we're going to review some case scenarios for timelines on category status, and we'll look at some snapshots of category progression. So time spent in category 3. So I'm going to zoom in on this picture on the next slide, but just to make sure everyone kind of sees what we're looking at here. You can see there's like some color bands. So the vertical columns on this slide, I'll go ahead and go forward. The vertical columns are each of the weeks, right? So every week, how we're looking back 52 weeks of samples. So the vertical columns are the category that we make each week. And if you see at the very bottom of the screen, we've got these horizontal bars. Those horizontal bars are the moving windows. Those are where we look at 13 at a time, 13 at a time, 13 at a time, and you can see how the horizontal bars move over 1 week at a time. So let's focus on the vertical bars first, and this is the step 1 we talked about in the beginning. Every vertical bar is a step 1, where that week we come up with the category for that week. And you can see in window 1 there, right, that establishment has 5 positives and a bunch of negatives, which is 11.7%, which gets them in category 3. And the vertical bar 2, right, we can see that one of the positives dropped off and it was replaced by negative. Sorry, there's 6 positives, and this is the one at the bottom. One of the positives dropped off and it's replaced by negative. So for that 1 week, they're at 9.8%, which is category 2. And you can see that we recompute this going across time for each vertical bar. And we color-coded this to make it easier to see. So the red vertical bar there is when the establishment was category 3 for that 1 week of part 1. The 3 orange bars that are next to it, windows 2, 3, and 4, that establishment was Category 2 for those 3 Part 1s, those 3 weeks. And in weeks 5 through 17, you can see they're all green where that establishment was Category 1 in those weeks as positives dropped off, and they added more negative samples. So now moving to the horizontal bars, the Part 2, and again, the horizontal bars are the official category that shows up in the PHIS reports and on the website. You can see that in that very first window there, right, there's a red week 1. So there's 1 week 1 that's red, and there's 3 yellow weeks. And so that establishment ends up being, for the official category, they're Category 3 because we had the 1 red vertical bar. The next week, we move over to window 14 as the final week. Because we used 13 weeks, window 1 dropped off. So now we have 10 green and 3 yellow. Well, the yellow one is, the 3 yellow ones are where the establishment was in Category 2. And if you remember our definitions, then that's where we resolved to. And so you can see that horizontal bar is in Category 2. So then moving forward, you can look at this where the establishment was in Category 3 that week, then it was in Category 2 for 3 more weeks, and because they kept getting negative, then they moved up to Category 1. So that's kind of this establishment suppression going from when they moved out of Category 3 to Category 2 and into Category 1. Moving forward, the next slide. So follow-up sampling. So we've had a lot of interest in the follow-up samples, and we've started doing those on both the carcasses. And basically what happens when we do follow-up samples is we add more samples to that denominator, and as long as an establishment has fixed their process control and those samples show up negative, you end up with fewer positive, or the same number of positives, but out of fewer total samples, which means the percentage drops. So for this example, right, we can see an establishment that had 6 positives when they had 52 samples. We conducted follow-up sampling. They got all negatives on those, and now they're at 6 positive with 68 samples. So with and without follow-up sampling, we can see that in this theoretical example, it would move that establishment from Category 3 to Category 2 in that same window, which helps it as it moves across time. So to kind of visualize it for everyone that wants to visualize it, if we take the same establishment, right, the same number of positives, and if we did not do follow-up sampling, that would be the first, the red bar. But the second vertical bar is where we did do follow-up sampling, right, and you can see a whole bunch of negatives, and because it changes that percentage, it changes that establishment's category. So follow-up sampling can help an establishment get from Category 3 to Category 2 quicker, but it really depends on the results of those samples. They need to be negatives for us to get the right swing. Okay, next section is FSIS category communication. And in this section, we want to talk about how FSIS communicates these categories. And as I mentioned a couple times, it's available in the Establishment Profile Report in PHIS, in the FSIS quarterly establishment letters that we mail out, the category status alerts that come through PHIS on our side, and then public posting of category status to the FSIS webpage. And to kind of give just a couple more details, the PHIS Establishment Profile Report includes the category status for poultry carcasses subject to FSIS performance standards for Salmonella, so chicken and turkey carcasses. These are available to establishments through your industry access to PHIS, and they're updated weekly to reflect the most recent completed windows. As you're aware, quarterly letters are mailed to establishment management, and they contain the most recent category information for the poultry carcasses establishments at that time, plus all your other sampling results. We do an alert. So on FSIS side, we issue an alert to our in-plant personnel when an establishment's category is declined, and so the category 3 alert goes out to our inspection personnel, normally sooner, but definitely within 3 business days of an establishment moving into Category 3, and when we assign the follow-up samples, they get notified about that. And establishment category assignments are performed approximately 10 days after the close of each moving window to allow the lab processing time for all applicable samples. It's kind of just a footnote, but just to make sense of, you know, we collect a sample today. It takes about 10 days to make sure that we get all the samples collected today, analyzed and in the data system, and all the results final. So there's a little bit of lag on that side. And then website category posting. And as you're aware, each establishment's category information is updated and posted monthly on the FSIS website. The Establishment-specific categories for carcasses are updated monthly, and the aggregate categories are updated monthly. And those are both going to be there on our website. All right, FSIS responses to category status. Just in general, just everyone's aware of this. If an establishment goes into Category 3, FSIS will conduct a PHRE, focusing on the corrective actions, which could possibly result into an FSA or other, depending on what we find. And then we collect follow-up samples as frequently as once per shift, which we've already talked about. Finally, going forward, FSIS will start posting establishment-specific categories for poultry carcasses on January 22nd, 2018. That's Friday. We're going to Monday, sorry, 1 week from yesterday. We're continuing to compute categories on a weekly basis, which again are available to you in PHIS. The weekly calculations are in those PHIS reports. The monthly calculations are available on the FSIS webpage, and we intend to begin posting category status for Salmonella for individual establishments that produce chicken parts and comminuted poultry products in June 2018. And that's it. So, moderator, we are finished and we're available for questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, as we move to Q&A, please feel free to place yourself into the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. You will hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. To submit a written question, use the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Choose All Panelists from the Send To drop-down menu. And at this time, we don't have any questions in the queue.
We'll just wait a minute and see if anyone has a question or if they need to unmute or...
We did get a written question from Tina. Will the presentation be made available after the call?
Yes. Once we can get it cleared and posted to our website, we will post the webinar. I don't have an exact timeline for when that will happen, but it'll be probably by tomorrow.
Matthew asks, is there a preview of the format used for reporting the category listings on the website?
In the constituent update that went out on December 20th, there's actually a screenshot of what it will look like.
Are there any more questions? Anyone on the...
Got a new one in. Wade asks, if the follow-up sampling results in the establishment staying in Cat 3, what is the next step?
Well, I mean, it was included on the slide. There would be follow-up samples and there would be a PHRE and through the PHRE, FSIS would then evaluate whether FSIS should also do an FSA. We're also, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say we're continuing to look at whether there should be additional follow-up actions. We're still looking at that, but that's those are the follow-up actions right now.
Ron asks, how will brand new plants be assessed?
Well, anytime a new establishment comes online, they would get added to our sampling frame based on their production volume, and we would start collecting samples. And once we have enough sampling results to assess them to the performance standards, then they would be assessed like anyone else.
Ron asks, is an example of a PHRE report available?
Can you repeat the question?
Is an example of a PHRE report available?
So this is Bill Smith. That whole process is defined in a directive, the 5000 series. I don't have it right in front of me. If a PHRE is actually done by the EAIO, and they will assess whether they need to do further follow-up action or not. Any time that a EIO would be coming into a plant to perform an FSA, or any actions would be taken as a result of the PHRE, the plant would be fully informed of those actions, and either when the EIO gets there or when the IPP that are at the plant would notify the plant of any actions as a result of the PHRE.
And that's in Directive 5100. It's revision 4. It's on the website.
James asks, on the quarterly report, is it calculated by 15 months or 13 months?
The last 3 months or 13 weeks.
Of 52 weeks.
Of 52-week moving windows, to be specific.
Tina says, this has been a very good info. Thank you.
Thanks for calling in.
Deborah asks, so all categories 1 through 3 will be posted, not just
Yes.
Cat 3?
Yes, that's correct.
And at this time, there are no further questions.
This is Carmen Rottenberg. I just want to close out, or while some of you are thinking if you have any additional questions, I want to thank you for, we had a really large participation today, and I want to thank Todd Reed and all the folks in FSIS who have been having communication both with the Chicken Council and Turkey Federation on this issue, and for their requests for us to have this webinar. I think it's really valuable to have these kind of webinars and opportunities that we can present information and take questions. This does not preclude anyone, if you have additional follow-up questions, from contacting Todd or others on staff. As always, our staff here in D.C. and around the country are available to answer your questions. So do we have any last questions before we close out today?
No new questions came through.
All right. Well, we thank you all. We'll be looking to get this up in the next 24 hours on the website. And then, of course, if you have follow-up questions, again, feel free to reach out. Thanks again for participating today.
Thank you for joining today's conference. The call has now concluded, and you may disconnect.